There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be written down, not because it is secret or sacred or deliberately withheld, though sometimes it is all of those things, but because the medium it requires is not paper. It requires years. It requires the specific accumulation of attention that comes from living inside a landscape, until the landscape becomes something you can read the way a scholar reads a text, the way a musician reads a score, finding in what appears to others as silence or emptiness a precise and detailed language that has been speaking all along. The great desert basins of the American West, the Great Basin, the Sonoran, the Mojave, the Chihuahuan, are among the most demanding environments on Earth, for the simple reason that water, the one thing no living creature can do without, is scarce, unpredictable, and concealed. It does not announce itself. It does not flow in channels that a traveler from a wetter country would recognize as water sources. It hides in rock formations, under dry riverbeds, inside plants that give no outward indication of their internal moisture. It moves seasonally, appearing in one location in spring and vanishing entirely by summer, reappearing somewhere else in a pattern that takes decades to learn and that changes year to year in ways that require continuous updating. The people who lived in these landscapes for thousands of years before European contact did not find water by luck. They did not find it by carrying enough of it with them, because carrying water across hundreds of miles of desert terrain on foot or horseback is not a viable strategy. The weight alone defeats the traveler before the distance does. They found it because they had learned to read the desert the way it needed to be read, with the full attention of multiple senses accumulated across generations, refined through the specific kind of observation that only sustained, intimate familiarity with a landscape produces. This knowledge was not simple. It was not a list of tricks that could be learned in an afternoon. It was a complete and sophisticated understanding of how water moved through arid landscapes, where it went, how it traveled underground, what signs on the surface indicated its presence below, which plants required it and which merely tolerated its absence, how animals behaved in relation to it, what the geology of a region meant for where it would concentrate and where it would not. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, science. Systematic, empirical, tested against reality over thousands of years of trial and consequence. The consequences of being wrong about water in the desert are not subtle. They are fatal. And so the knowledge that survived was the knowledge that was accurate. The first and most fundamental skill in desert water finding was the reading of topography, the shape of the land itself. Water obeys gravity. This is the most basic fact of hydrology, and it was understood intuitively and practically by every desert people in the American West. But understanding that water flows downhill is only the beginning. The more sophisticated knowledge lay in understanding where in a landscape that appeared uniformly dry and flat, the water that fell as infrequent rain actually went, not where it ran on the surface, which was brief and obvious and often misleading, but where it went afterward underground as it continued its journey toward the lowest available point in desert terrain. That underground journey is shaped by geology in ways that are invisible from the surface but legible once you know how to read it. In the surface features that geology creates, a dry wash, a sandy channel between low rocky banks that carries water only during and immediately after rainstorms, appears to an unfamiliar eye as simply a dry place. To someone who knew how to read it, a dry wash was a map. It indicated that water had concentrated here repeatedly over a long time. It indicated that the sandy substrate might hold subsurface moisture for weeks or months after the last rain. It indicated that digging at a specific point in the wash, typically at the outside of a curve, where water slows and drops its load and the substrate tends to be coarser, might reach moisture at a depth of a few feet even in the driest months. The Paiute people, who inhabited much of the Great Basin for thousands of years, developed this understanding of dry wash hydrology to a degree of precision that continued to astonish outside observers well into the period of European-American contact. They knew not just that a particular wash held subsurface water, but where in that wash it was most concentrated, what depth was required to reach it at different times of year, and how the moisture level changed across the seasons. This was knowledge accumulated across generations of systematic observation, transmitted through oral tradition, and continuously updated through the direct experience of each generation of learners. Plants were perhaps the most reliable indicators of water in the desert landscape, and the people who read them did so with a specificity that goes well beyond the simple observation that vegetation tends to cluster around water sources. Different plants have different relationships to water. Some require it in large quantities and will grow only where it is reliably available. Others are adapted to minimal moisture and tell you little about water specifically. The skill lay in knowing which plants were which species were, in effect, walking advertisements for subsurface moisture, and which were simply drought-tolerant and therefore uninformative. The cottonwood tree is one of the most reliable indicators of permanent or near-permanent water in the American West. Its roots require consistent moisture, and it will not grow where that moisture is unavailable. A stand of cottonwoods visible at a distance across the desert was, to someone who knew this, a near certain indication of water within reach of digging. Even in the absence of any visible surface flow, the Comanche, the Apache, the Navajo, and virtually every other desert people of the Southwest used cottonwood groves as navigational beacons, not just as landmarks, but as promises of water that could be trusted across the seasons. The willow offered a similar but more specific signal. Willows not only indicated water but tended to grow where water was close to the surface, within a few feet, typically, and where the water table was relatively stable. A line of willows following a dry wash indicated not just that water was present, but that it was accessible, that the effort of digging would be repaid. The mesquite told a different and more complex story. Mesquite is extraordinarily drought-tolerant and will survive in conditions that most other trees cannot, but its roots, which can extend downward for many tens of feet, are also capable of reaching water sources that are far too deep for most other vegetation to access. A stand of mesquite in an apparently waterless location was not a reliable indication of water near the surface, but it was an indication that water existed somewhere in the substrate, and in a desert landscape where the question is not just whether water is present, but whether it is reachable. This distinction mattered enormously. The barrel cactus, which stores significant quantities of water in its pulpy interior, was known across the desert Southwest as an emergency source. It required effort to access. The top had to be removed and the pulp mashed and squeezed, and the moisture it yielded was limited and sometimes slightly caustic. But it was available in locations where nothing else was, and the knowledge of where barrel cacti grew, in what densities, at what times of year, was part of the comprehensive water knowledge that desert peoples maintained. Animal behavior was another layer of the reading, one that operated across a different timescale and provided information that plant indicators could not. Birds in the desert are perhaps the most immediate indicators of water. Many desert bird species drink regularly and must therefore know where water is. Their flight patterns, in the late afternoon when they are moving toward water before roosting, trace invisible lines across the landscape that point, for those who know how to read them, toward sources that might be miles away. The specific species of bird matters. Some, like doves and quail, drink daily and do not stray far from water. A concentration of doves moving in a consistent direction in the late afternoon is a reliable indication that water lies somewhere along that line of flight, within a range of a few miles at most. The Tohono O'odham people of the Sonoran Desert, whose traditional territory encompassed some of the most arid land in North America, developed an understanding of bird behavior in relation to water sources that was detailed enough to use not just for locating known water sources, but for identifying new ones. The specific birds, the specific time of day, the direction and altitude of flight, the degree of urgency in the movement. All of these were legible signs in a language that took years to learn and that once learned, transformed the desert from a featureless and threatening expanse into a landscape annotated with information. Insects offered a different kind of signal. Bees require water and maintain a reliable relationship to sources within a few miles of their hives. The direction of bee flight, a long-observed navigational fact that European settlers also knew and used, pointed toward water with considerable reliability. But the desert peoples of the Southwest went further, distinguishing between loaded bees returning to a hive and unloaded bees leaving one, and using the flight patterns of both to triangulate the direction and approximate distance of a water source. Larger animals told longer and slower stories. Trails worn into the desert surface by the repeated passage of animals moving toward water, bighorn sheep, antelope, deer, were maps of a kind that once identified as animal trails rather than random marks, pointed toward water with the authority of thousands of repeated journeys. These trails tended to converge as they approached a water source, multiple paths merging into a single, wider track, a pattern that, once recognized, was one of the most reliable navigational signals available in terrain without other landmarks. The knowledge of geology, the specific rock types and formations that indicated underground water, represented perhaps the most technically sophisticated dimension of desert water reading, and it is the one that most consistently surprised outside observers who encountered it. Certain rock formations act as natural collectors and conductors of underground water. Limestone is particularly significant because it dissolves over time and creates underground cavities, springs, and channels through which water moves reliably and predictably. A limestone formation visible at the surface, identifiable by its characteristic gray-white color, its layered texture, its tendency to form specific kinds of ridges and outcroppings, indicated to someone who understood its hydrology the possibility of spring seeps, were tanajas, natural rock basins that collected and held rainwater long after the rain itself had passed. The Apache had detailed knowledge of tanaja locations across vast stretches of the Chihuahuan Desert and the desert ranges of what is now Arizona and New Mexico. Tanajas were not permanent water sources. They depended on rainfall and evaporated in time, but they were predictable in their locations, consistent in their capacity, and could be mapped and remembered across generations with the precision of fixed landmarks. An Apache warrior or a family group moving across the desert knew not just where the tanajas were, but which ones held water at what time of year, which were reliable in drought years and which dried first, which were accessible and which were too remote or too difficult to reach to be useful in a given situation. This knowledge was not static, it was continuously updated. Each generation that used a tanaja observed how its behavior differed in wet years and dry years, added that observation to the accumulated record, and transmitted a more detailed and accurate picture to the next generation. The knowledge that an elder carried about a particular water source was not just that the source existed, it was a multi-decade record of that source's behavior under varying conditions, which made the elder's judgment about whether that source would be reliable in the current season far more accurate than any single-year observation could be. The transmission of this knowledge, how it moved from generation to generation, how it was taught and learned and tested, is as instructive as the knowledge itself. It was not transmitted through maps. Maps, in the European sense, graphic representations of territory encoded on a durable medium, were not the primary tool. The desert peoples of the American West had spatial memory of extraordinary precision, developed through years of direct experience with the terrain and supplemented by oral traditions that encoded geographical information in story songs, and ceremonial practices that simultaneously preserved knowledge and gave it cultural meaning. The Hopi people maintained what ethnographers have called landscape narratives, stories that described in geographic sequence the features of a travel route, including water sources, landmarks, and the relationships between them. These were not simple directions. They were richly detailed accounts that embedded geographical information in a narrative structure that made it memorable, that connected individual water sources to the larger patterns of the land, and that preserved not just the locations of water, but the conditions under which each source was reliable and the alternatives to be sought if a primary source was unavailable. A young person learning to travel in the desert learned these narratives the way a young person in a literate culture might learn to read a map. Not as mere entertainment, but as practical knowledge with immediate life or death relevance. The stories were tested against reality on every journey, updated when conditions had changed, and corrected by the accumulated experience of everyone who traveled the route. They were, in effect, a living database, distributed across the memory of the community rather than stored in any single place, and therefore resilient against the loss of any individual carrier. The testing of this knowledge against reality was rigorous in the way that only genuine consequences can enforce. A young person who misremembered the location of a water source did not simply get a problem wrong on an examination. They arrived at a dry place in a desert, with the next water source perhaps 2 days' travel away, having already used the water they were carrying. The consequences were immediate, physical, and potentially fatal. This enforcement mechanism, harsh as it was, produced a kind of learning that was both highly motivated and highly accurate. There is a figure in the historical record of the American West who illustrates the practical application of this knowledge with unusual clarity. His name is not recorded with certainty in the English language sources, but he appears in the journals of several overland expeditions of the 1850s and 1860s as a guide or scout of Apache or Pima origin, referred to variously by anglicized names or simply as the Indian Guide. What is recorded in expedition after expedition is the specific quality of his navigational ability. He could, in terrain that experienced Anglo-American scouts found completely featureless, lead a party to water with a reliability that seemed, to those who had not grown up with equivalent knowledge, almost supernatural. He would study the landscape, look at the vegetation, observe the flight of birds, examine rock outcroppings, read the surface of dry washes, and then set a course toward water that he'd often never personally visited, or had not visited in years, or had visited only once as a child, accompanying an elder on a similar journey. The expedition leaders who traveled with guides of this kind left accounts that, read together, reveal a consistent pattern of reaction. Initial skepticism. This man says there is water in that direction, but there is nothing visible to suggest it. Grudging observation as the guide's predictions proved accurate, again and again. Finally, something approaching awe. Not the romantic awe of men encountering mystery, but the more sober awe of men who understood, at least partially, that they were in the presence of a form of knowledge that their own civilization had not developed and could not easily replicate. One expedition leader wrote that the guide saw in the desert what a physician sees in a patient, not the surface but the underlying condition, not what the land showed, but what it meant. This comparison, made by a literate man from the eastern United States in the middle of the 19th century, is more accurate than he probably knew. What the guide was doing was diagnosis, the application of a comprehensive framework of understanding to the specific features of a specific landscape in order to determine what those features indicated about conditions that were not directly visible. The comparison between this kind of knowledge and the knowledge that the frontier failed to develop in other domains, medicine, leadership, community building, is not accidental. The same qualities that made the desert water readers effective were the qualities that were absent in the frontier failures that history has recorded. The water readers learned from consequences. The physician who bled cholera patients could attribute the deaths to the disease and continue. The water reader who was wrong about a water source faced the consequence directly, immediately, personally. There was no mechanism for reassigning the cause of failure. The desert was honest in a way that the doctor's examination room was not. The water readers accumulated knowledge across generations rather than assuming that what one person could learn in a single lifetime was sufficient. The wagon train captain who trusted his own judgment over the mountain man who had just come through the pass was making the opposite assumption, that his single season of experience was more reliable than someone else's decades. The water reader understood, institutionally and practically, that no single person's knowledge was sufficient, that the knowledge of the community across time was the only knowledge adequate to the demands of the desert. The water readers maintained humility about what they did not know. They observed before acting. They tested their assumptions against reality before committing fully to a course that could not be reversed. The frontier entrepreneurs who built towns around single resources and assumed the boom would last were doing the opposite, committing fully to an assumption without adequate testing, without sufficient humility about the difference between what they knew and what they needed to know. These are not coincidental parallels. They are the same underlying quality, the willingness to let accurate information about the actual world override comfortable assumptions about it, appearing in different contexts and producing different outcomes. The specific techniques that desert peoples use to extract water from sources that European travelers consistently overlooked or dismissed as dry deserve examination in some detail, because they reveal an engineering intelligence that is easy to underestimate. The practice of digging for water in dry stream beds was widespread and well-developed. It was not random digging. It was targeted excavation based on a sophisticated understanding of where subsurface water would concentrate. At the outside of bends, where water slows in flood conditions and deposits coarser sediment. At points where two washes join, where the combined flow creates a deeper deposit. At the base of rock outcroppings that channel runoff into the adjacent substrate. These were not obvious locations to someone without specific knowledge, and the ability to identify them accurately across a wide range of geological conditions represented a real and learnable skill. The construction of water catchments, earthworks designed to direct and concentrate rainfall runoff, was practiced by several southwestern peoples, most notably the Tohono O'odham, whose extensive canal systems, in what is now central Arizona, represented one of the most sophisticated water management achievements of pre-contact North America. But smaller-scale catchment construction was also common. Simple earthen berms and diversion channels that, in a region where rain fell rarely but sometimes heavily, could concentrate the runoff from a large catchment area into a small storage basin that would hold water for weeks or months. The use of specific plant parts as emergency water sources was knowledge that went well beyond the barrel cactus. The roots of certain plants hold significant moisture even when the plant itself appears dry. Specific tree roots, the roots of certain Palo Verde and ironwood species, could be cut and the moisture pressed or sucked out of them in emergency conditions. The pads of certain cactus species, when the spines were removed, could be consumed for their moisture content. The dew that condensed on rock surfaces and vegetation in the cold desert nights could be collected on cloth and wrung out, a technique that seems minimal until you consider that survival sometimes depends on what is available in the minimal. None of these techniques was taught in isolation. Each was part of a comprehensive understanding of the desert water system, its sources, its movements, its seasonal patterns, its responses to the variation between wet years and dry years. The individual techniques were expressions of the underlying knowledge. Without the underlying knowledge, they were incomplete. With it, they were components of a toolkit that allowed people to move through terrain that would kill an unprepared traveler within days. The encounter between this knowledge and the knowledge of European American settlers and soldiers in the 19th century was, in most cases, a study in the failure of the more formally educated group to recognize what they were encountering. There are exceptions. The expedition leaders who understood that their guides knew something real and important and who deferred to that knowledge with the humility that the situation required. But the dominant pattern was dismissal. What the guides knew was not recognized as knowledge, in the European American sense of the term, because it was not written down, not certified by an institution, not expressed in the technical vocabulary of European science. It looked to eyes trained to recognize knowledge in particular forms, like intuition or luck, or the exotic instinct that European culture attributed to indigenous peoples as a way of marveling at their abilities without fully crediting their intelligence. The cost of this dismissal was borne primarily by the settlers and soldiers who paid for it in thirst and sometimes in death. Parties that rejected the guidance of people who knew the desert and relied instead on maps that showed water where water no longer was, or that showed nothing in places where water could be found by those who knew how to look, paid for that rejection, at a rate that should but did not force a reconsideration of whose knowledge was actually more reliable in the context that mattered. The knowledge that allowed human beings to live, travel, and thrive in the American desert for thousands of years before European contact was not inferior knowledge. It was different knowledge, developed through a different process, transmitted through a different medium, applicable in a context that the formal education of the 19th century had not prepared its graduates to navigate. The failure to recognize it as knowledge and to learn from it with the humility that genuine learning requires was one of the more consequential intellectual failures of the frontier period. What that knowledge represents, viewed from a distance, is something that every human enterprise eventually needs and most find it difficult to develop. The understanding that the environment you are operating in has its own logic, that this logic is learnable, and that learning it requires a quality of sustained, humble, consequence-tested attention that cannot be shortcut by confidence or credentials or the conviction that what you already know is sufficient. The desert does not negotiate. It does not adjust its demands to match the preparation of the people entering it. It presents the same conditions to the man who has spent 30 years learning to read it, and to the man who has spent 30 days crossing it with a half-full canteen and a map that was made by someone who had never been there. The difference in outcomes between these two men is not a difference in courage or intelligence or effort. It is a difference in knowledge, specific, accurate, tested knowledge about how this particular landscape actually works. The people who accumulated that knowledge did so over a period of time and through a process of learning that the frontier mythology of the individual self-sufficient pioneer did not accommodate and did not value. The pioneer was supposed to conquer the landscape through will and ingenuity. The desert peoples had done something harder and more permanent. They had learned to live with it by understanding it. That understanding, the patient multi-generational consequence-tested understanding of how the water moves through the land, outlasted every frontier town that was built and abandoned every wagon train that miscalculated its water supply, every army expedition that arrived at a dry spring expecting to find what the map promised. It outlasted them because it was built from something more durable than optimism or confidence, or the conviction that a new arrival can learn in a season what a landscape has taken centuries to teach. The desert is still there. The water is still moving through it, underground, following the geology, appearing where the cottonwoods grow and the birds turn in the late afternoon sky, and the rock basins hold their quiet reserves through the dry months. The knowledge of how to find it was real. Parts of it survive, and the lesson it contains, about what it means to actually know something, as opposed to merely believing you do, has not expired with the frontier that failed to learn it.